The fires reached the sky. Thick smoke curled over the golden domes of Constantinople as the wind carried the smell of burning wood, melting wax, and something worse. Fear. It was April 13th, 1204, and the city wasn't under siege by outsiders. No Muslim army, no foreign invader. This destruction came from those who wore the cross. The soldiers setting the city alight were Christians, Crusaders. They came not with mercy, but with torches and steel, and they had already forgotten the Christ they claimed to follow. Inside the Convent of Christ Pantoptes, 43 nuns knelt on cold stone. Their heads were bowed, their hands tight in prayer. "Kyrie eleison," they whispered, trembling. "Lord, have mercy." These women had given everything to God: youth, beauty, silence, comfort. Their days were filled with worship and work, with candlelight hymns and the ache of worn knees. They had expected hardship, even death, but not like this. Not from fellow believers. Sister Euphemia was the eldest among them, a 73-year-old woman with white hair like winter snow and hands stiff from decades of devotion. Her rosary pressed into her fingers, so tight that the wood dug into her skin. She didn't fear dying, but this was something else. Outside, the sound grew louder, boots on stone, drunken laughter, the groaning crack of splintering wood. A scream rang out from the convent next door, sharp and short, then nothing. The nuns froze. Sister Anna, the youngest, just 17, clutched a silver cross passed down from her grandmother. Sister Maria, the abbess, whispered for calm, her voice steady but her eyes full of dread. And then the door burst open. They came in like a flood. Men in armor, their tunics marked with red crosses, reeking of wine and blood. Some shouted in languages the sisters didn't understand. Others laughed and wore a gold-stitched patch across his chest. Deus vult, God wills it. Euphemia stood. Her voice, shaped by years of singing hymns, rang out with strength that defied her age. "We are brides of Christ. You wear his symbol in his name." A man stepped forward and struck her. His fist met her face with a sickening crack. Her body hit the floor. Blood spread beneath her hair like a crimson halo. The others screamed, but the Crusaders did not stop. They had come not to fight enemies, but to take what they believed was owed. What happened next wasn't conquest. It wasn't even war. It was something darker, something the world would try to forget. But the nuns would not forget, and neither should we. Before the doors were broken, before the screaming started, before Sister Euphemia's blood stained the chapel floor, this had all begun with promises. Promises made in Rome, in Venice, in dark halls lit by candlelight, where men spoke of God but planned for power. It started in the year 1198. Pope Innocent III was young, clever and burning with holy purpose. He wanted to take Jerusalem back from Muslim hands, but he knew the old ways had failed. Thousands had died on foot, walking across deserts, starving and broken, before they even reached the Holy Land. This crusade would be different. This time, the armies of Christ would sail straight to Egypt, strike the heart of Islamic power, and move north to reclaim the sacred city. It was bold. It was clever. It was a trap disguised as a blessing. Tens of thousands came, French knights hungry for honor, German soldiers trained for battle, merchants looking to turn war into gold. Venice, with its powerful navy, offered ships. The Crusaders agreed to pay a massive price for the fleet, 85,000 silver marks. But when the time came to leave in 1202, the Crusaders couldn't pay. They were thousands short. Too many men had failed to show up. Too much money had already vanished. Now 30,000 men stood in Venice, armed and ready, with no way to leave. The leader of Venice, an old and nearly blind man named Enrico Dandolo, saw his chance. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Calm and cold as stone, he offered a deal. "You owe us 85,000 marks, he said. "But I will forgive your debt if you do one favor." The favor? Attack Zara. Zara was a Christian city. Not Muslim, not pagan, Christian. It had once belonged to Venice, but had rebelled. Now the Pope had forbidden any crusader from harming Christians. To attack Zara would mean excommunication, eternal damnation. But what else could they do? They were broke, trapped, surrounded by ships they couldn't use. Hungry soldiers don't think about salvation. They think about survival, so they attacked. In November 1202, Christian soldiers stormed a Christian city, burning homes, killing civilians. The Pope was furious. He excommunicated the whole Crusader army. Still, the crusade did not die, because while they rested in Zara, another offer came, this time from a young Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelus. He had been overthrown. His uncle now sat on the throne in Constantinople. Alexios was desperate, exiled, and full of promises. "Help me," he said. "Help me reclaim my throne, and I will pay everything you owe. I'll give you gold. I'll reunite the Eastern Church with Rome. I'll fund your entire campaign to Egypt." It sounded like a miracle. But it was a lie. Still, it was enough. The Crusaders turned their ships not toward Jerusalem, not toward Egypt, but toward Constantinople, the richest Christian city on earth, where thousands of monks, priests, and nuns still believed their faith would protect them. They had no idea what was coming. They arrived in June of 1203. The Crusaders' ships, tall as towers, lined the sea like a fleet from another world. The people of Constantinople watched from the walls, confused and afraid. These were supposed to be Christian allies, brothers in the faith. Why were they coming armed? The Crusaders didn't hide their goal. They wanted to place Alexios Angelus back on the throne. At first they used words. They promised peace. They warned of war. And the people, already tired of their own emperor's rule, gave in. Through a mix of threats and political deals, the young prince returned to power. But promises are easy to make when you're desperate. Harder to keep when you're standing in the ruins of a crumbling empire. Alexios had nothing, no gold to pay the Crusaders, no power to fix the city, no unity to offer the church. He had spoken too much too soon, and Constantinople, proud and ancient, quickly turned against him. By early January 1204, the people rose up. They hated the Crusaders. They hated Alexios. They blamed him for letting foreign soldiers into their sacred city. They stormed the palace, dragged him away, and, some say, strangled him with a bowstring. His body vanished. A new emperor took his place and gave a clear message to the Crusaders: "Leave now, or we will destroy you." The Crusaders, still stranded, still starving, now had no leader, no money, and no future. They sat outside the walls of the greatest Christian city in the world, humiliated and hungry. Inside, gold glittered in church vaults. Priceless relics filled every chapel. The Hagia Sophia, the largest church in Christendom, stood like a crown at the city's heart. The Crusaders called a council. No record tells us exactly what was said, but the result was clear. They would take Constantinople for themselves. On April 9th, they began the attack. 3 days later, the walls fell, the emperor fled, and a city that had stood for nearly 1,000 years was left open. What followed was not war. It was a storm of chaos. No orders, no rules. Just rage, greed, and holy symbols turned into weapons. The sun rose on April 12, 1204, over a city that no longer had a leader, an army, or any hope left. The Crusaders flooded through the broken gates like a wave that had finally crashed after years of building. But instead of order, what came was madness. They were supposed to be men of God, soldiers of the cross. But the moment they entered Constantinople, their symbols lost all meaning. The cross on their chests, the prayers on their lips, none of it stopped what they did next. The historian Nikitas Choniates, who watched it all from a window, would later write about the unspeakable acts he saw. He said they smashed holy images and threw relics into filthy corners. They brought horses and mules into sacred churches, into places where emperors had once kneeled to pray. Inside the Hagia Sophia, they stripped the altar bare, looted every icon, and broke open silver doors that had stood for centuries. But what words could never fully capture was the humiliation. A prostitute climbed onto the patriarch's throne in the Hagia Sophia and danced, while drunken soldiers clapped and cheered. Sacred relics were passed around like trophies. Gold chalices used for communion were filled with wine and spilled on the floor. Outside, churches burned. Inside, silence was broken by screams, but it was in the monasteries and convents that the true darkness unfolded. Men who wore the cross turned into something else entirely. They didn't see holy women when they broke through the doors of the Convent of Christ Pantoptes. They didn't see servants of God. They saw objects, trophies, rewards. They had convinced themselves that these women were heretics, followers of a broken church, unworthy of protection. They told themselves it was war, that God had chosen them to win, but what they did next had no place in war. Sister Euphemia lay on the chapel floor, her mouth swollen and her hair sticky with blood. The other nuns huddled at the back of the room. The youngest, Sister Anna, just 17. The oldest, Sister Maria, who had led prayers in this place for decades. Then one man stepped forward, Guillaume of Champlit, a knight from Burgundy, his armor stained, his eyes glassy with drink. He was no nameless soldier. He was a nobleman. And yet he looked at the women like they were animals. "These are heretics," he said. It was a lie. Even the Pope had never said that. Sister Anna stepped forward, trembling, holding a silver cross close to her chest. Her Latin was broken, but her meaning was clear. "We follow Christ. Just like you. Please." Guillaume snatched the cross from her hand. He looked at it, scoffed, then threw it against the wall so hard the silver bent. "Your Christ lost," he said. "Ours won," and with those words the final wall broke. What happened next, the scribes couldn't write down fully. Some tried. Some stopped halfway through sentences. But we know, because survivors remembered. The air inside the chapel turned cold, heavy with fear, and something worse, the knowledge that no one was coming to help. The cries of the city still echoed outside, but inside these stone walls, time seemed to stop. The men laughed. Some tore down icons and tossed them aside like trash. Others kicked over prayer stands, knocked over candles, shattered the quiet of centuries in moments. But then things changed. The violence wasn't just against objects. It turned toward the women. Sister Maria, nearly 70, stood between the soldiers and the youngest of the sisters. Her voice didn't shake. She didn't beg. She simply told them they were in a house of God and that these were his servants. For a moment, even the Crusaders hesitated, until Guillaume of Champlit stepped forward again. He looked Sister Maria in the eye and reached for the golden relic she wore around her neck. She slapped his hand away and clawed at his face, her fingers leaving red streaks down his cheek. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the old woman and hurled her down the stone steps leading out of the chapel. The sound of her skull hitting the stone was loud and final. She lay still at the bottom, her eyes open but empty. The others screamed, but the men didn't stop. They dragged the nuns away, one by one. Some fought, others prayed, but none were spared. This wasn't about faith anymore. It wasn't about heresy or war. It was about power, about what people do when they believe they're allowed to be cruel, when they believe God is on their side no matter what. Sister Euphemia, still bleeding on the floor, watched helplessly. Her eyes burned, not just from pain, but from helplessness. She had lived through famines, plagues, and invasions, but this betrayal came from within the faith. These men had taken communion. They had prayed before battle, and now they were committing acts that would shame even the devils they claimed to fight. Elsewhere in the city, the same scenes played out. Convents torn apart, monasteries ransacked, priests beaten, icons stolen. Nuns taken. Some of the women were never seen again. Others, later listed in Venetian records, were sold. Greek women of religious profession, the documents called them. Not names, not stories, just property. Christian women sold by Christian men to Christian buyers. Some were taken to estates in the Holy Land. Others were shipped to Venice. A few were seen in slave markets, still wearing scraps of their old habits, their eyes empty, and all the while, the Crusaders cheered. They believed they had won. 3 days after the sack began, the fires in the city had died down. Smoke still hung over Constantinople, but it was quieter now, quieter in the way a battlefield goes quiet after everyone has either fled, died, or surrendered. Bodies lay in the streets. Broken icons floated in fountains. Churches smelled of wine and sweat instead of incense, and in the ruins of the Convent of Christ Pantoptes, Sister Euphemia opened her eyes. She had lost track of time. Her head throbbed. Her lips were split. Her fingers could barely move. But she was alive. She dragged herself across the blood-stained floor, calling out the names of her sisters. Most didn't answer. Some never would again. She found Sister Anna crouched in a corner, her habit torn, her silver cross gone, her hands shaking so badly she couldn't even cry. Of the 43 women who had gathered in prayer just days before, barely a handful were still breathing. Euphemia knew what had happened. She didn't need to ask. The silence told her. The stains on the floor told her. The broken bodies of those who had once sung hymns beside her told her. She also knew they couldn't stay. So she led the survivors, those who could still walk, out of the ruined convent, down side alleys, past burning homes and broken gates. They didn't head west. That way led to more crusaders, to more soldiers claiming the city as their prize. Instead, they went east, through the countryside, and deeper still into unfamiliar lands. It would take years for Sister Euphemia to reach safety. Years of hiding in villages, of walking barefoot along mountain paths, of praying to a God who now felt impossibly far away. But she never stopped. Eventually, she reached Thessalonica in Greece and joined a small Orthodox monastery. There, surrounded by other survivors, she stayed. Not as a nun anymore. Not really. She had no convent, no habit. Only her memory and the faces she could never forget. In that quiet monastery decades later, she told her story. She was 110 years old when she spoke her last words to a priest who came to record what she remembered. Her hands trembled as she described everything. The faces of the men who stormed her convent. The sound of Sister Maria's body hitting the steps, the screams, the symbols, the crosses stitched in gold. He wore the cross, she said, and he made us suffer in Christ's name. The priest didn't interrupt. He wrote down every word. Then, when she was gone, he hid her testimony deep in the monastery's archives, knowing that the Catholic Church would never want such a story made public, and for centuries it remained buried until the world was finally ready to listen. The world moved on. The Crusaders who destroyed Constantinople returned home with carts of gold, relics, and silk. They were welcomed as heroes. Guam of Champlit, the knight who threw Sister Maria down the steps, was rewarded with land. He became Prince of Achaia, a new Latin state carved from the broken bones of Byzantium. He ruled there for years, died in comfort, and was buried in a church funded by stolen treasure. The Catholic Church, humiliated by what had happened, tried to smooth it over. Pope Innocent III had condemned the sack in letters, but his words were too late and the damage too great. The Church shifted the story. Historians began calling the Fourth Crusade a diversion, a mistake, a sad twist in a noble mission. They wrote about the art that was lost, the churches that were damaged, the gold that vanished, but they didn't write about the nuns. They didn't mention Sister Euphemia. They didn't say her name. They didn't write about Sister Anna, 17 years old, sold in a slave market like livestock. They didn't speak of the 43 small crosses carved into the chapel floor of Christ Pantoptes, because telling that story meant admitting what had really happened, that the greatest Christian army of the age had turned on its own, that men who wore the cross, who prayed before battle, had committed sins so deep they echoed through centuries, and so for hundreds of years. The story stayed buried until 1967, on a quiet day in the library of Mount Athos. A Greek historian named Anastasios Karpouzelos opened an old manuscript. The pages were cracked with age. The ink had faded to brown, but the words were there. The testimony of Sister Euphemia. He read it once, then again. He couldn't believe it. A nun, 110 years old, describing in detail what the world had forgotten. The blood, the screams, the betrayal, the faces. The man with the red cross who said, "Your Christ lost." Karpouzelos published her account in 1970. It shook the Orthodox world, but the West mostly ignored it. It didn't fit the narrative. It didn't match the romantic image of knights in shining armor fighting holy wars. It was too ugly, too raw, too real. But the Orthodox Church had never forgotten. Every year on April 13th, in monasteries from Greece to Russia, candles were lit, not for the relics that were stolen, not for the gold, but for the women who vanished. For the voices the world tried to silence, the memory lived in whispered prayers, in hidden archives, in names carved into stone. And now, finally, the silence was beginning to break. The question people often ask is, why does this story matter now? Why remember what happened in a convent 800 years ago? Why speak of old wars, forgotten names, buried crosses? Because it was never just about religion. It was never only about crusades or emperors or relics. It was about what happens when men convince themselves that their cause is so holy, so righteous, that anyone who disagrees becomes less than human. When symbols of peace and sacrifice are twisted into tools of power and cruelty, the men who stormed the convents of Constantinople believed they were doing God's will. They believed the wealth of the East was owed to them, that these women were heretics, that the cross on their chest gave them permission to do the unthinkable. Guillaume of Champlit didn't see Sister Maria as a servant of Christ. He saw her as an obstacle, and he removed her like one. That's what makes this story terrifying, not because monsters did monstrous things, but because ordinary men, convinced of their righteousness, did evil and called it holy. History, as they say, is written by the victors, but memory belongs to the survivors. And the Orthodox Church remembered. They remembered Sister Euphemia, who forgave but did not forget. They remembered Sister Anna, taken at 17, never seen again. They remembered the 43 names carved into stone in the last moments before the doors broke open. And finally, in 2004, something changed. 8 centuries after the sack, Pope John Paul II visited the Orthodox Patriarch in what was once Constantinople. And he did something that no pope had done before. He apologized for the Fourth Crusade, for the sack, for the betrayal, for the sins committed not by enemies of the faith, but by its own soldiers. But it was too late for the women of the convent. Sister Maria never heard the apology. Sister Anna never saw her name remembered. Sister Euphemia died in a small monastery far from home. Her memory is still bleeding beneath her skin. Their story didn't appear in most history books. Western scholars debated whether the Crusaders were justified, whether the Byzantines brought it on themselves. They wrote about strategy, tactics, logistics. They didn't write about the altar where a prostitute danced. They didn't write about the cross that was ripped from a girl's hands and thrown against the wall. They didn't write about the priest's final words. Recorded as Euphemia passed, she said she forgave them because Christ commanded it. But she begged us not to forget, because forgetting is how it happens again. That is why this story matters, because when the past is buried, the same lies rise again, the same cruelty wrapped in new flags, the same evil hiding behind new causes. The story of the nuns of Constantinople is not just a warning from the past. It's a mirror, and if we look into it, really look, we might see what we're still capable of. The 43 small crosses scratched into the stone floor are still there, beneath layers of ash and dust. A prayer follows them, barely visible, written in trembling hands, "Father, forgive them. They knew not what they did." Except they did. They knew, and they did it anyway. So now we remember not to curse, not to condemn, but because the moment we stop remembering is the moment we begin to repeat.